Picture a village frozen in time, empty houses standing like silent sentinels, their windows staring blankly at overgrown paths where children once played. The air is thick with the weight of unanswered questions, and the only sound is the whisper of wind through crumbling stone. But here's the strangest part: there are no graves. No markers, no traces of the dead. It's as if the people who lived here simply vanished, leaving behind no record of where they rest. This is the haunting mystery of a village with no graves, and the mystery of its vanishing legacy, a place where history itself seems to have swallowed its own secrets whole. What could make an entire community disappear without leaving behind the most basic human tradition, a final resting place? Archaeologists and historians have puzzled over this enigma for decades, sifting through folklore, faded records, and the silent testimonies of abandoned homes. Some whisper of a forgotten ritual, a mass exodus, or even something more unsettling. The absence of graves isn't just odd, it's unnatural. Every culture, no matter how ancient or remote, honors its dead in some way. So why does this village stand as a stark exception? The answer, if there is one, lies buried beneath layers of time, waiting to be uncovered. Today, we're stepping into the shadows of this forgotten place, piecing together clues like detectives unraveling a centuries-old cold case. We'll explore the whispers of local legends, dig into the sparse historical accounts that survive, and examine the scientific theories that try to make sense of the impossible. This isn't just a story about a missing graveyard, it's a journey into how communities remember, how history forgets, and what happens when the line between the two blurs into silence. By the end, you'll see why this mystery has captivated so many, and you might just find yourself questioning how well we truly know the past. The truth is out there, hidden in the echoes of empty streets. Let's go find it, tucked away in a valley so remote that even modern maps struggle to pinpoint it. This village seems almost too isolated to be real. Thick forests press in from all sides, their tangled branches forming a natural barricade, while jagged mountains loom like silent guardians. It's the kind of place where fog clings to the ground long after sunrise, and the only roads in are little more than goat paths worn into the earth centuries ago. Yet what's truly unnerving isn't the isolation, it's what's missing. Walk through the overgrown square, past the hollow shells of homes, and you'll search in vain for the one thing every village inevitably leaves behind: graves. No weathered headstones leaning in the grass, no ancient burial mounds crowned with wildflowers. Even the local folklore, passed down through generations in neighboring towns, falls eerily silent when it comes to death rituals. Just 20 miles away, villagers proudly maintain cemeteries dating back hundreds of years, places where families still gather to honor ancestors, leaving offerings of candles and fresh earth. But here, nothing. It's as if the very concept of mortality was erased. Early explorers who stumbled upon the village in the 1800s wrote of their unease in faded journal entries. One noted, the absence of burial grounds is as conspicuous as a missing limb, while another speculated that the villagers must have disposed of their dead in some unthinkable way. Could the landscape itself hold the answer? The valley sits atop a labyrinth of underground rivers and local caves, some large enough to swallow a household hint at possible hiding places. Were bodies carried away by water or concealed in chambers too deep to find? Or was there something darker at work, a reason the villagers chose or were forced to vanish without a trace? The theories begin here, in the silence between the trees and the echoing emptiness of the land itself. The paper trail should tell us everything: names, dates, the quiet details of ordinary lives. But when researchers comb through archives searching for answers about this vanished village, they hit a wall of silence. Birth records exist, fragile pages listing newborns swaddled and blessed in the local church. Marriage certificates survive too, ink faded but vows still legible. Yet when it comes to death, the records stop cold. No funeral notices, no burial permits. Not even a single line scribbled in a priest's diary to mark a passing. It's as if the villagers were born, lived, and then simply stepped off the page. One historian described it as a community that forgot to die, a phrase that lingers like a ghost in the stacks of yellowed documents. Compare this to nearby towns, where parish books meticulously chronicle every soul's departure dates carved in stone matched by ink on parchment. But here, the absence feels intentional. Was it negligence, a fire that consumed only the pages about the dead, or something more unsettling? Some speculate the village's isolation bred secrecy, that they handled deaths in ways too unconventional to record. Others whisper of a pact, a collective decision to vanish without leaving traces for outsiders to find. Then there's the folklore. While official records stay stubbornly blank, local tales hum with unsettling hints. A shepherd's diary from 1823 mentions a warning from an elder. They don't bury their own, the earth won't take them. Another account describes lights seen deep in the forest on moonless nights, as if the departed were led elsewhere. These fragments raise more questions than answers. If the villagers didn't bury their dead, where did they go, and why go to such lengths to hide it? The archives may be silent, but the land itself might still hold the truth, if we know where to listen. The forest around the village doesn't just hide crumbling houses, it guards secrets wrapped in whispers. Older generations in nearby towns still speak in hushed tones about what happened there, spinning tales so chilling they feel more like warnings than stories. One legend tells of villagers who walked into the mist, vanishing one evening without a sound, their footprints stopping abruptly at the tree line as if they'd been lifted into the sky. Another speaks of the old ones, shadowy figures said to emerge from caves during the darkest nights, collecting those who dared to speak the names of the dead aloud. The most persistent thread, a taboo so strong it bordered on fear. No one was allowed to acknowledge death, not in words, not in rituals, not even in grief. To break this silence, the stories say, meant inviting something far worse. A folklorist who spent years documenting these tales noticed something unsettling. The legends all share an eerie consistency, as if rooted in real events. Could this taboo have been born from something as tangible as a plague? Imagine a sickness so devastating that the mere mention of the dead felt like summoning the illness back. Or perhaps it was forced migration, a sudden evacuation where the living were warned never to look back, lest they meet the same fate as those left behind. The stories might be metaphorical, a way to process collective trauma too painful to address directly. One theory suggests the village's isolation amplified their fear of outsiders, leading them to erase all traces of their dead to protect them from desecration, or to hide something they didn't want the world to find. Yet for all their vividness, these legends leave us with more questions than answers. How much is folklore and how much is fractured history? Science offers tools to probe the mysteries. Soil analysis could reveal hidden mass graves, while DNA testing might trace where the villagers' descendants went, if they survived at all. But even technology struggles to untangle stories this old, where every truth is wrapped in layers of fear and time. The real horror may not be in the tales themselves, but in what they conceal. A community so terrified of remembering that they chose to disappear twice, first in body, then in memory. And that silence, more than any ghost story, is what lingers. Ground-penetrating radar swept the valley floor, its electromagnetic pulses probing the earth like a surgeon's scalpel, but the scans came back empty. No coffin nails, no bone fragments, not even the faintest shadow of a burial pit. Archaeologists expected the usual clues: a child's skeleton curled in the fetal position, an elder laid to rest with a copper bracelet, the telltale collapse of soil where a wooden casket had rotted away. Instead, they found only silence beneath their boots. One dig team uncovered a rusted sickle and a stack of intact dinner plates near what might have been a hearth, but the moment their trowels scraped deeper, hoping for graves, they hit nothing but undisturbed clay. An archaeologist who worked the site for 3 seasons described the frustration. Villages this old always leave their dead behind. It's not a choice, it's human nature. But here, it's as if they treated death differently, like it was something to hide or erase. The absence defies logic. Even cultures that practiced cremation left behind urns or charred bone shards. Some theorize the villagers might have used the valley's labyrinth of limestone caves, dropping bodies into sinkholes where acidic water dissolved flesh and bone within weeks. Others point to sky burial traditions, placing the dead on high platforms for birds to carry away, but no ropes, no wood fragments, no feather remnants support the idea. Then there's the Exodus theory. A single family might vanish without a trace, but an entire village. If they fled en masse, driven by war or famine, why take the time to empty graves but leave behind tools, toys, even half-woven baskets? Unless they weren't the ones who moved the bodies, unless something or someone made sure no trace of the dead remained, the soil holds no answers and the caves keep their secrets. All we know is this: in a world where every culture leaves behind its dead, this village chose or was forced to do the impossible, to disappear twice. The Black Death swept through Europe like a shadow, wiping out entire villages in months. Mass graves from the 1400s still surface today, unearthed by storms or construction crews, revealing jumbled skeletons, their bones telling silent stories of panic and desperation. So could this explain the village with no graves? At first glance, the plague seems a perfect fit. A horror so swift it left no time for proper burials, no survivors to dig them. Some researchers point to cases like Iam in England, where whole families perished together, their bodies buried where they fell. But here's the catch: those places left traces. Pits, markers, charred remains from attempts to burn contaminated homes. This village shows none of that. A microbiologist specializing in ancient diseases offers a grim alternative. What if the strain here was so lethal, it killed faster than the plague's usual timeline? Imagine a fever so brutal it struck down every villager within days, leaving no one alive to tend to the dead. Rodents or wild animals could have scattered the remains, nature erasing the evidence over centuries. But skeptics fire back: where are the fragments, the teeth which resist decay, the buttons or nails from shrouds? Even the deadliest plagues leave behind something. Then there's the paper trail, or lack of it. Plague outbreaks were meticulously documented, with quarantine orders and death tolls etched into regional archives. Yet searchers turn up no mentions of illness here, no panicked edicts from nearby towns to bar travelers, no mass graves in adjacent valleys either, which you'd expect if the disease had spread. It's as if this village existed in a bubble, untouched by the horrors that ravaged the rest of the continent. So if not plague, what? The next theory is just as unsettling. What if they saw death coming, not from disease but from another threat entirely? Something that made them gather their living and flee into the unknown, leaving behind everything, even their dead. History shows us that communities don't just disappear, they leave breadcrumbs. The lost colony of Roanoke carved Croatoan into a tree, a cryptic clue pointing to their fate. The Donner Party's grim trail was marked by abandoned wagons and bones, but this village nothing, no hastily scrawled notes, no signs of struggle, just empty homes and a silence so complete it feels deliberate. So if the villagers fled, what could have driven them to leave so abruptly and so thoroughly? War is one possibility. Imagine invaders cresting the valley's ridge, torches flickering in the dusk. Panicked villagers might have gathered what they could carry and vanished into the forest, vowing never to return. But history books record these conflicts, armies boast of conquests, survivors petition for aid. Yet no chronicles mention battles here, no neighboring towns speak of refugees arriving en masse. Religious persecution fits too. Secretive groups often sought isolation to practice forbidden beliefs. But persecuted communities typically resurface elsewhere, their traditions preserved in new settlements. A genealogist spent years tracing surnames from regional archives, hoping to find descendants in distant cities. Her search turned up empty. It's as if the villagers dissolved into the air. Then there's famine. A prolonged drought could have withered crops, forcing desperate choices. But starvation leaves evidence, weakened bones in shallow graves, tools abandoned mid-use. Here, the absence feels calculated, which raises a chilling alternative. What if the villagers didn't leave willingly? Some whisper of slavers sweeping through remote valleys, capturing entire populations. Others point to darker theories, a purge perhaps orchestrated by outsiders or even their own. One faded manuscript from a monastery 50 miles away mentions a cleansing in the region, though the details are lost to time. Without graves, without records, the truth may be uglier than disappearance. It may be erasure. Mass graves from massacres often leave behind unmistakable signs, scattered weapons, fractured skulls, the chemical traces of burned thatch still clinging to the soil centuries later. Yet when forensic teams examined this village, they found none of these markers, no hastily dug pits filled with jumbled bones, no arrowheads embedded in doorframes. Not even the faintest residue of fire on the stone foundations. It's as if the village bypassed violence entirely, slipping out of history without a struggle. But how likely is that? The region was no stranger to conflict. Historical records from the 1600s describe raids by rival clans, entire settlements wiped out in a single night. Yet those tragedies left echoes, charred timbers, mass graves, survivors' accounts etched into parish records. Here, the silence is deafening. One controversial theory, proposed by a historian specializing in forced migrations, suggests something more systematic than a massacre: enslavement. Imagine armed traders descending at dawn, rounding up the living and leaving no one behind to bury the dead. It wouldn't be the first time a population vanished into the ledgers of slavery, their names erased, their origins rewritten. But even this theory stumbles on logistics. Enslavers rarely bothered to conceal bodies. Why waste the effort? And neighboring villages would have noted such an event, their own records bristling with fear or condemnation. Yet no such accounts exist. Then there's the scholar who points to assimilation, not by force but by choice. Could the villagers have abandoned their homes to join another group, shedding their old identities like outgrown skins? In rare cases, persecuted communities did exactly that, melting into larger towns and adopting new customs to survive. But assimilation leaves traces, surnames resurfacing in distant census records, oral traditions that stubbornly linger. Here, the trail doesn't just go cold, it evaporates, which leads us to the most unsettling possibility. What if the absence of graves wasn't an accident, but a deliberate act? Not by outsiders, but by the villagers themselves. What if their beliefs demanded something so radical that it rewrote the rules of death entirely? Anthropologists have long studied cultures that defy our expectations of death, societies where the end of life isn't marked by graves, but by rituals so radical they erase all physical traces. In the Himalayas, some communities practice sky burials, leaving bodies on mountaintops for vultures to scatter to the winds. Others, like the Toraja of Indonesia, keep their deceased relatives in their homes for years, treating them as sleeping guests until funds are raised for elaborate funerals. Then there are the seafaring cultures that consign their dead to the ocean's depths, where water dissolves all evidence. Could the villagers have embraced a belief system so extreme that even bones were forbidden to remain? One particularly striking parallel comes from a remote Tibetan sect where the dead were dismembered, their bones ground into powder and mixed with barley flour to be offered back to nature. To outsiders, it seems unthinkable: no markers, no remains, no way to mourn at a fixed site. Yet for them, it was the ultimate act of reverence, a surrender to the cycle of rebirth so complete that not even ash was left behind. If this village held similar beliefs, it would explain the eerie absence of graves. Death wasn't an end to memorialize, but a transformation to hasten. The body returned to earth so thoroughly that no one could cling to its memory. But here's where the mystery deepens. Most cultures that practice such rituals still preserve stories, songs, prayers, carved effigies to honor those who have passed. Why would this village take the extraordinary step of erasing not just bodies, but their very names from history? A clue might lie in the concept of second death, found in certain esoteric traditions. In these beliefs, to speak the name of the dead is to bind them to this world, preventing their final journey. If the villagers feared this fate, they might have scrubbed every mention of the departed, burning records and silencing stories to free their loved ones' souls. Religion often serves as both compass and catalyst for such extreme practices. Imagine a charismatic spiritual leader preaching that graves were anchors tethering spirits to corruption, or a prophecy warning that unburied bones would summon calamity. History is littered with examples of faiths that demanded radical breaks with tradition: early Christians who rejected pagan funeral rites, or certain Zoroastrian groups who built towers of silence to keep decaying flesh from polluting sacred earth. If the village's beliefs were tied to an apocalyptic creed, their disappearance might not be an accident but a final act of devotion. The question isn't just how they vanished, but what they thought awaited them on the other side. Yet even this theory leaves gaps. If they destroyed all traces of the dead to honor them, why abandon homes full of everyday objects? Why leave behind plates, tools, half-woven baskets, items that held no spiritual weight? Unless the exodus itself was part of the ritual, some nomadic cultures believe dwellings should be left intact when a people move on, a gift to the land that sustained them. Could the villagers have walked away not in fear, but in fulfillment of some deeper covenant? The answer, if it exists, lies at the intersection of faith and fear, where the rules of the living bend to the mysteries of what comes after. Certain faiths hold that to bury the dead is to trap them, to chain souls to the earthly plane when they should be free. Imagine a belief so absolute that even the whisper of a name could summon a spirit back, binding it to suffering. In the Zoroastrian tradition, bodies are laid atop towers of silence, left to the elements and carrion birds so decaying flesh won't pollute sacred earth. Similar practices appear in Tibetan sky burials, where vultures carry the departed skyward, leaving no trace behind. Could this village have embraced a doctrine even more extreme? A theologian who studied fringe sects points to an obscure text from the 8th century describing a cult that believed to mark a grave is to build a prison for the soul. In their eyes, erasing all physical remnants might have been the ultimate act of love, breaking the cycle of attachment to let the dead move on. Yet this creates a haunting paradox. If the villagers were so devoted to their faith, why is there no trace of altars, no fragments of prayer beads, no carvings invoking gods or ancestors? Most religions leave echoes of their rituals, ashes from offerings, worn spots where knees bent in prayer. Here, the absence feels total, as if devotion itself was forbidden. One scholar speculates that their belief system may have demanded a double silence: no memorials for the dead, and no visible worship of the divine, a faith so inward that even its existence had to be concealed. But what if the answer isn't just spiritual? What if it's written into the land itself? The valley sits atop a fault line, and seismic activity could have swallowed evidence whole. In Japan, entire graveyards vanished overnight during the Great Earthquake of 1707, the earth yawning open to reclaim the dead. Could tremors here have collapsed burial caves or triggered landslides that buried the village's secrets under tons of rock? Or consider the region's acidic soil, capable of dissolving bone within decades. Nature has its own ways of erasing history, no faith required. The truth might lie somewhere between belief and geology, a people who saw the land itself as sacred, its rivers and caves the only acceptable vessels for their departed. No markers, no ceremonies, just silent surrender to the elements. A farewell so complete it left nothing behind but questions. The ground beneath this village isn't just dirt and stone, it's a living, shifting puzzle. Limestone bedrock, the kind that forms this valley, is notorious for its instability. Water seeps through tiny cracks over centuries, dissolving rock until the earth above collapses without warning. Geologists who mapped the area found a honeycomb of caverns beneath the village, some large enough to swallow entire buildings. It's not hard to imagine a scenario where graves, carefully dug generations ago, slowly vanished into the depths. One sinkhole opening under a cemetery could drag dozens of bodies into darkness, leaving no trace on the surface. A researcher who studied the region's erosion patterns noted, "This isn't just soil, it's a sieve." Given enough time, it could erase entire chapters of history, but there's a haunting counterpoint to this theory. While sinkholes can explain missing graves, they don't discriminate. Why would they only swallow the dead and leave everything else behind? Tools, pottery, even delicate items like woven baskets survived the centuries undisturbed. If the earth was hungry enough to consume burial sites, why spare the homes and everyday objects? The answer might lie in the village layout. Ancient settlements often placed cemeteries at the edges, near unstable slopes or above natural drainage paths, areas more prone to collapse. A survey of the village perimeter revealed telltale depressions in the land, subtle dips that suggest long-sealed sinkholes. Could the graves have been deliberately placed in these danger zones, as if the villagers knew the earth would eventually claim them? Compare this to the Yucatan cenotes, where water preserves bones for millennia in crystal-clear pools. There, the dead are visible, suspended in time. Here, the opposite may have happened. Bones dissolved by acidic groundwater or crushed under collapsing cave ceilings. Modern tools like ground-penetrating radar struggle to map such chaotic subterranean landscapes, their signals scattering like echoes in a maze. But new technology offers glimmers of hope. LiDAR scans, which use lasers to see through dense foliage, have uncovered lost cities beneath jungle canopies. Applied here, they might reveal sinkholes hidden under layers of soil and vegetation, silent traps that swallowed the village's dead whole. Yet even if science confirms graves were lost to geology, the mystery only deepens. Why wouldn't the villagers adapt? Most cultures, when faced with vanishing burial grounds, find alternatives: mausoleums, cremation, sacred caves. The complete absence of any death rituals suggests something more deliberate than accidental loss. Unless, of course, the sinking earth wasn't just a hazard, but part of the tradition itself. Some ancient belief systems viewed caves as gateways to the underworld and sinkholes as mouths of the gods. What if placing bodies in these unstable zones wasn't negligence, but devotion? A way to ensure the dead were physically delivered to another realm. The line between natural phenomenon and sacred act blurs, leaving us to wonder, did the earth steal these graves or were they given freely? LiDAR technology has revolutionized archaeology, peeling back layers of jungle and forest to reveal lost cities invisible to the naked eye. In Cambodia, it uncovered the sprawling metropolis of Angkor Wat suburbs, hidden for centuries under dense canopy. In the Amazon, it exposed vast networks of ancient roads and settlements swallowed by the rainforest. But when researchers turned these laser eyes toward the village with no graves, the results were baffling. The scans cut through the overgrowth with ease, mapping every crumbled wall and forgotten footpath, yet the ground where graves should have been showed only undisturbed earth. One archaeologist staring at the featureless data muttered, "LiDAR sees through trees, not time. The problem isn't just technical, it's human. Technology can reveal what's hidden, but it struggles with what was never there to begin with." LiDAR detects physical alterations to the landscape, ditches, mounds, the subtle depressions left by decomposed coffins. But if a culture refused to dig graves or disposed of their dead in ways that left no mark, even the most advanced tools hit a wall. Consider the practices of the Sami people in northern Scandinavia, who once placed their deceased on wooden platforms among the branches, letting the forest reclaim them. Centuries later, nothing remains but stories. Could this village have followed a similar tradition, leaving nothing for lasers to find? Then there's the darker edge of the puzzle. LiDAR can't distinguish between natural absence and deliberate erasure. If the villagers systematically destroyed burial sites, burning bones, scattering ashes in rivers, technology would see only empty ground. Historical precedent exists. During the Reformation, zealots razed cemeteries to purge papist idolatry, leaving behind fields that still puzzle archaeologists today. Was this village silence not an accident but a choice? A team surveying the area did find one anomaly, a patch of earth near the village center with strangely compacted soil, as if something heavy had once rested there before being meticulously removed. No tools, no remains, just the ghost of an impression, like a shadow after the light has gone. This leads us to the most unsettling question of all. What if the missing graves aren't a result of lost rituals or geological quirks, but something far simpler? What if the dead were never buried here at all? Across cultures, there are rare but documented cases of communities who carried their deceased far from home, believing spirits could harm the living if kept too close. The Mongols, for instance, sometimes transported bodies to remote death valleys, leaving no trail for mourners to follow. Could this village have enacted a similar separation, hiding their dead beyond the valley's borders to sever all ties? The next clue might not lie beneath our feet, but beyond the horizon, in places we've yet to think to look. Among the most tantalizing theories about this vanished village is the idea that its people weren't hiding from death, they were trying to conquer it. Whispers of an immortality cult have circled for decades, fueled by fragments of alchemical texts discovered in a nearby monastery. One crumbling manuscript, dated to the 1600s, describes a secretive brotherhood in the mountains who believed death was a disease to be cured, their bodies preserved through rituals involving rare herbs and metals. Could this village have been their sanctuary? Proponents of the theory point to the absence of graves as proof. If no one died, no one needed burying. Legends from the region speak of an ageless village where elders retained the vigor of youth, their faces unlined by time, but historians urge caution. The same scholar who translated the alchemical text notes, seeking immortality leaves more traces than this laboratory's elixir recipes, failed experiments. This village shows none of that. Indeed, cultures obsessed with eternal life, from China's Qin dynasty to medieval alchemists, left behind elaborate tombs, potion vessels, and treatises on longevity. Here, there are no vials, no cryptic diagrams scratched into walls, no records of bizarre medical trials, even the most infamous immortality seekers, like the Count of St. Germain, who allegedly faked his death multiple times, couldn't erase all evidence of their attempts. Then there's the biological impossibility. No human settlement lasts without death. Children are born, the elderly fade, accidents happen. To believe the village achieved literal immortality stretches credulity, unless their definition was different. Some fringe researchers suggest they may have pursued spiritual immortality, viewing graves as anchors that trapped souls in the physical world. In this light, the missing burial sites become not a failure to die, but a refusal to let death define them. A single carved stone found near the village well seems to support this. Its worn inscription, translated tentatively as "to linger is to lose," might hint at a belief in swift spiritual release rather than bodily preservation. Yet for all its intrigue, the immortality theory crumbles under scrutiny. It's the kind of explanation that feels satisfying, mystical, dramatic, until you realize it raises more questions than it answers. Why abandon homes full of possessions if you've conquered death? Why leave behind no instructions, no maps for others to follow? The truth may be far simpler, hidden not in grand aspirations but in the mundane. Perhaps the villagers didn't vanish because they sought eternity, but because they faced something far more ordinary, a threat they couldn't outrun, a change they couldn't resist. The answer might not lie in the stars, but in the soil underfoot, waiting to be uncovered by someone willing to look beyond the legends. Sometimes the simplest explanation is hidden in plain sight, not in secret rituals or geological quirks, but in the dry, dusty pages of bureaucracy. What if the village's missing graves aren't a mystery at all, but a quirk of jurisdiction? Picture this: a long-forgotten land dispute with the next parish over, or a tax evasion scheme so clever it involved hiding the dead. Across Europe, border villages often shared cemeteries to save space or avoid fees. In the Alsace region, for example, tiny hamlets still bury their dead across the river in Germany, where burial taxes were historically lower. Could this village have done the same, slipping bodies into neighboring soil to dodge a greedy landlord or an unpopular law? The theory gains traction when you examine the region's old property records. One faded map from 1723 shows the village's boundaries abruptly redrawn, cutting off access to their traditional burial ground. A tax ledger from the same era notes a sudden spike in funerary fines imposed by the local lord, a penalty so steep it might have forced the living to get creative. If villagers couldn't afford to bury their dead on consecrated land, they might have resorted to clandestine graves in the woods or across the parish line, where no official would think to look. It wouldn't be the first time poverty rewrote the rules of death. Yet there's a flaw in this neat solution. Even shared graveyards leave paper trails, receipts for plot purchases, notes in a priest's diary, complaints from neighbors about overcrowded burial grounds. Here, the silence is absolute. No neighboring village claims the bodies, no court records mention trespassing corpses, no folk songs lament the indignity of a borrowed grave. And that raises a darker question. What if the absence isn't just bureaucratic but psychological? Imagine a community so traumatized by loss, by plague or persecution, that they couldn't bear to memorialize it. In post-war Bosnia, some survivors refused to mark mass graves, fearing the attention would attract fresh violence. Could this village's empty earth be a kind of collective survival instinct, a way to erase the past in order to endure the future? The truth might lie somewhere between paperwork and pain. Perhaps the villagers did bury their dead elsewhere, not to cheat taxes, but because their grief demanded distance. Or maybe the graves are missing because the deaths themselves were too terrible to record. When loss defies understanding, sometimes the only memorial is silence. There's a peculiar phenomenon that haunts not just individuals, but entire communities: the way trauma can rewrite history by erasing itself. Think of post-war towns where bullet holes were plastered over, where mass graves were paved into parking lots, not out of indifference, but because remembering was too unbearable. Psychologists call it collective amnesia, a survival mechanism so powerful it can scrub entire chapters from a culture's memory. Dr. Elissa Varga, who studies trauma in isolated societies, describes it like this: when pain becomes part of the air you breathe, the only way to keep living is to pretend it doesn't exist. No graves mean no funerals mean no grief. Could this explain the village silence, a community so shattered by loss that they chose to unremember death itself? History offers eerie parallels. In the Spanish town of Belchite, bombed to rubble during the Civil War, survivors rebuilt their homes right beside the ruins, leaving the shattered buildings untouched, a silent monument no one would speak of. In Hiroshima, the skeletal dome of the atomic bomb Genbaku was preserved while the city around it reinvented itself, as if the trauma could be contained within a single structure. These places didn't forget exactly. They compartmentalized, carving out the horror like a tumor to protect the rest of the body. But what happens when the compartmentalization is so complete that even the tools of remembrance, graves, records, mourning rituals, are discarded? Language itself might hold clues. Linguists studying the region note a curious gap in the local dialect. No words for cemeteries, no euphemisms for death, not even the gentle idioms cultures often use to soften the blow of loss. It's as if the vocabulary itself was pruned, like branches too heavy with fruit. Compare this to the Ainu people of Japan, who traditionally avoided speaking the names of the dead, believing it could trap their spirits. Or the Victorian obsession with sleeping instead of dying, turning mortality into something passive and quiet. But those cultures still buried their dead. They still acknowledged the act. Here, the linguistic void feels more absolute, a total refusal to name the unnameable. Yet silence is never just silence. It's a shape, a negative space that outlines what's missing. If the villagers' trauma was too vast to confront, their empty graveyards might be less a mystery than a monument, a memorial built from absence. The question isn't just how we uncover the truth, but whether we should. Some wounds scab over for a reason. To dig them up risks more than answers. It risks resurrecting a pain so old it's turned to stone. But then again, stones can speak if you know how to listen. Language doesn't just describe the world, it builds the walls around what we're allowed to think. So when a community's dialect lacks words for death, burial, or mourning, it's not just a vocabulary gap, it's a chasm where an entire concept should be. Linguists who scoured regional archives for traces of the village speech made a startling discovery. Not a single recorded euphemism for dying, no gentle idioms like passed on or gone to rest. Even neighboring towns with their own dialects had rich vocabularies for lost poetic phrases comparing death to the moon's retreat or the closing of a door. But here, silence, as if the very act of acknowledging mortality had been scrubbed from their tongues. One researcher stumbled upon an eerie parallel 30 miles east, where an isolated farming community referred to burial as planting. At first, it seemed quaint, a pastoral metaphor softening the blow of grief, but dig deeper and the implications grow darker. If you plant the dead like seeds, what do you expect to harvest? Some scholars argue this wasn't just linguistic flourish, but literal belief that the departed would somehow return, sprouting anew from the earth. Could the vanished village have taken this idea to its extreme? No graves because they expected no permanence, only a temporary resting place before rebirth. Yet the absence in their dialect goes beyond metaphors. Missing, too, are words for cemeteries, tombstones, even the tools of burial. It's one thing to soften death with gentle language. It's another to refuse language for it at all. This isn't evasion, it's erasure. A cognitive anthropologist who studied similar linguistic voids in other cultures notes, when you remove the words, you remove the possibility of the thought. No word for grave means no framework to conceive of one. Imagine a people who couldn't or wouldn't picture a final resting place. Without the linguistic scaffolding to build the idea, burial might have seemed as foreign as flight. But then there's the counter-argument. Perhaps the words existed once, only to be deliberately purged. History knows examples of linguistic cleansing, where conquerors or zealots banned native terms to suppress beliefs. In 19th century Canada, residential schools punished indigenous children for speaking their languages, severing ties to ancestral rituals around death. Could this village have suffered a similar rupture, their death vocabulary stripped away by some long-forgotten trauma? A single clue hints at this, a crumbling ledger from a nearby monastery, listing corrected terms for local dialects. Half the page is torn away, but one phrase remains, the sleep without a bed. Was this their original term for death, later forbidden? The most unsettling theory, though, requires no metaphor or coercion. What if the missing words reflect a horrifying practicality? A linguist specializing in disaster-induced language shifts points to communities near active volcanoes, where terms for future or tomorrow fade from use after generations of unpredictable destruction. When survival is day-to-day, planning becomes a luxury. Apply this to the village. If death was so constant, so overwhelming from plague or famine or violence, that grieving became unsustainable, language might have adapted to cope. No words for graves because no one had the time to dig them. No euphemisms because euphemisms require the luxury of denial. This brings us to the simplest explanation, and perhaps the saddest. What if the villagers didn't bury their dead because they couldn't, not for lack of belief or language, but for lack of survivors? In the wake of catastrophe, the living might have fled too quickly, or been too few to tend to the departed. The silence in their dialect wouldn't be spiritual or symbolic, but starkly literal. No one left to speak the words. The graves are missing because the hands that should have dug them were already gone. Amid all the theories, apocalyptic faiths, sinkholes swallowing the dead, even immortality cults, there's one possibility so mundane it's almost disappointing. What if the graves were simply plowed under? Picture a 19th century farmer, his hands calloused from labor, turning the earth for a new crop and unearthing bones too weathered to recognize. Without modern archaeology's reverence for the past, he might have reburied them haphazardly beyond the field's edge, or tossed them into the river to avoid unsettling his family. Over generations, relentless agriculture could have erased every trace, leaving no more record than a footprint smoothed by the tide. Construction offers another practical culprit. Villages expand, cellars are dug, roads paved. In the English town of York, medieval builders reused gravestones as foundation filler, their inscriptions hidden beneath tavern floors. A single quarry operation near the village could have carted off entire burial plots for limestone. grinding bones into mortar without a second thought. Even natural erosion plays a role. Soft soils like those in the valley slump over time, scattering remains downriver. A geologist studying the region notes, topography here shifts faster than memory. What was sacred ground in one century becomes a landslide's debris in the next. Yet for all its logic, the boring truth theory stumbles on one stubborn detail: scale. Farming might displace a handful of graves, but an entire village's worth, without a single artifact, a single tooth left behind. Dr. Lena Hart, a forensic archaeologist who's worked on dozens of disrupted burial sites, points out, destruction leaves patterns. Plows chip bones, construction crews report odd finds. Here, the absence is too complete, too clean. Even in places like Gettysburg, where wartime chaos left mass graves unmarked, modern technology has rediscovered them through soil discoloration and shrapnel fragments. This village's void defies even those subtle clues. Still, the legend persists precisely because the ordinary explanations feel inadequate. A local historian from the nearest town chuckles. Nobody tours the countryside to hear about fertilizer and bad record-keeping. They want ghosts, and he's right, the village's mystique has taken on a life of its own. Every year, visitors leave makeshift memorials near the empty fields, ribbons tied to branches, candles in glass jars, even handwritten notes addressed to no one. One reads, "If you can't rest, neither can we." It's as if the absence has become its own kind of tombstone, a monument to the unknowable. Modern communities around the valley have woven the mystery into their identity. The annual Festival of the Unremembered features lanterns released into the sky, symbolizing souls with no graves to call home. A craft brewery even produces a dark ale called Vanishing Legacy, its label featuring an empty plot of earth under a full moon. The skeptic might roll their eyes. Sometimes a missing graveyard is just a missing graveyard, as one archaeologist grumbles, but the cultural resonance is undeniable. The village silence speaks louder than any epitaph could. Perhaps that's the true lesson here. History isn't just about what remains, but what we do with what's lost. The empty fields force us to confront how fragile memory really is, how easily the past can be paved over or plowed under. And in that absence, we find not just a mystery, but a mirror. What does it say about us that we'd rather invent tales of cursed cults and vanished souls than accept that some truths might be buried too deep or too ordinary to ever recover? The village with no graves may never give up its secrets, but in the end, that's what makes it unforgettable. Every mystery needs its tourists, and this village is no exception. Over the past decade, what was once a crumbling relic has become a magnet for curiosity seekers, their cameras clicking at every moss-covered stone and boarded-up window. Local entrepreneurs wasted no time capitalizing on the intrigue. Ghost tours wind through the empty streets at dusk, guides spinning tales of phantom villagers who still sweep their porches at midnight. The annual Festival of the Vanished draws thousands, its stalls selling no graves t-shirts and artisanal candles scented like forgotten memories. One particularly inventive shop even offers mystery dirt in tiny vials, allegedly scooped from the village's most haunted spots. It's all harmless fun until you realize how quickly legend overwrites fact. Take the cider stand run by old Tomas, a third-generation local from the next town over. He chuckles as he pours samples of his spiritless apple blend, nodding toward the village. "My granddad swore they made up the whole no graves nonsense to sell more booze back in the 60s. Now look at us, whole economy runs on a ghost story." His skepticism cuts through the fog of melodrama, a reminder that not everyone buys into the supernatural hype. Yet just down the road, true believers gather in hushed circles, swapping theories about interdimensional rifts and government cover-ups. One woman clutches a dog-eared notebook filled with scribbled evidence, blurry photos of shadows she insists are spectral villagers. "You can't fake that kind of energy," she whispers. The real tension lies in what gets lost when folklore becomes a commodity. Historians grown as tour guides embellish facts, turning a puzzling archaeological absence into a campfire tale. A grad student researching the village records recounts her frustration. "I found a visitor's diary from 1922 that clearly mentions a small family plot near the church. But try telling that to the ghost tour company. They've literally mapped out an ectoplasm hot zone right over it." The distortion isn't just academic, it reshapes how we remember. When a mystery becomes a brand, the truth gets buried under merchandise and jump scares. Does it even matter what really happened when the legend has grown its own roots? For some, the village's power lies in its unanswered questions, not its facts. A poet who visits yearly argues, "Myths are how we process the unfathomable." Whether people vanished or just moved on, the story helps us confront how easily lives get erased. But others warn of a darker cost. An elder from a neighboring indigenous community voices unease. When you turn someone's absence into entertainment, you stop seeing them as people. These weren't characters in a spooky story. They were mothers, farmers, children. They deserve more than a T-shirt slogan. The debate circles back to ethics. How do we honor the past without exploiting its gaps? A historian leading truth tours offers one approach, guiding visitors through both the facts and the fiction. "Point out where the ghost stories diverge from the records," she says. "Let people sit with the discomfort of not knowing. Maybe that's the only way forward, to celebrate the mystery without silencing the real lives behind it." After all, the villagers may have left no graves, but they did leave something just as fragile: the right to be remembered as they were, not as we imagine them. There comes a point in every mystery when we have to ask, not just can we uncover the truth, but should we? For some descendants of the region, the village's empty fields aren't a puzzle to solve, but a sacred silence to respect. "Digging here would be like tearing open a wound that finally scarred over," says Marika Vasiliev, whose great-grandmother fled a nearby town during the turmoil of the early 20th century. "The dead have their reasons for hiding. Who are we to drag them into the light?" Her words echo tensions simmering in archaeology for decades, where the pursuit of knowledge often collides with the weight of tradition. Compare this to the ongoing debates over Native American burial sites in the United States, where excavation requests frequently meet fierce resistance. Tribal councils argue that disturbing ancestral remains isn't just disrespectful, it disrupts spiritual journeys begun centuries ago. "Science doesn't own the past," insists historian David Bear Claw, himself a Lakota descendant. Some stories aren't meant to be pulled from the ground like turnips. Yet archaeologists counter that understanding these stories can prevent history's repetition. Dr. Evelyn Cho, who led the LiDAR scans of the village, frames it bluntly. "Every time we choose not to look, we risk losing lessons that could save lives." What if this village holds clues to surviving pandemics or environmental collapse? Isn't that worth a little discomfort? The heart of the conflict lies in a single, uncomfortable question: is curiosity a form of trespass? When we pick at the threads of the past, are we unraveling secrets or sanctity? The village's eerie quiet seems to whisper its own answer. Unlike Pompeii or Troy, where disaster froze moments in time, this place feels deliberately emptied, as if its people signed a pact with oblivion. To dig might not just be invasive, it could be a betrayal. Yet the mystery has already seeped into the realm of imagination. where artists and writers have given the vanished villagers new life. Novels paint them as immortal beings who walked into the mist, their bodies never aging, their graves never needed. Paintings depict shadowy figures tending invisible crops under a blood-red moon. Even a popular video game series tucked the village into its lore as a place where death takes holiday. These creative resurrections offer a compromise of sorts, a way to honor the mystery without violating its silence. Perhaps that's the truest legacy of a village with no graves. It forces us to stand at the edge of the unknown and decide what matters more, the satisfaction of answers or the reverence of letting some questions linger. After all, not all absences are empty. Some are vessels waiting to be filled with the stories we choose to tell. The village's eerie silence hasn't just baffled historians, it's ignited the imaginations of storytellers. From pulpy paperbacks to blockbuster films, its empty streets have become a stage for every kind of nightmare. Take the 1968 cult novel The Unburied, where the villagers are trapped in a time loop, doomed to relive their final day without ever dying. Or the indie horror flick Hollow Ground, which reimagines the missing graves as portals to a dimension where the dead still walk. Each retelling twists the facts to fit its era's fears. The Cold War versions, full of shadowy government conspiracies with villagers disappeared by faceless agents. The eco-horror wave of the 90s painted them as martyrs to a poisoned land, their bodies absorbed by vengeful soil. Even a Grammy-nominated folk album spun the tale into a ballad about ghosts who forgot they were ever alive. What's fascinating isn't just the creative license, it's how consistently these fictions contradict the few known facts. The real village shows no signs of panic, no hastily abandoned meals or upturned carts. Yet filmmakers can't resist adding these details as if tragedy requires clutter. A historian consulting on one production recalls arguing, "The houses weren't ransacked, they were left like someone just stepped out for air. The director overruled her, audiences need stakes." This tug of war between truth and drama reveals something telling. The village works best as a metaphor. It's not a place anymore, it's a Rorschach blot for whatever haunts us. Science, though, is less poetic. Recent advances in isotope analysis could finally trace the villagers' origins through the minerals in their teeth, if any remains are found. Drones equipped with thermal cameras now scan the valley for hidden chambers, while AI sifts through centuries of weather data to pinpoint droughts or floods that might have driven them away. Even the tourism boom plays a role. Hikers armed with GPS log anomalies in the terrain, crowdsourcing clues professionals might miss. The truth may emerge not from a single eureka moment, but from a mosaic of tiny breakthroughs. Yet part of the village's magic is how it resists answers. Like Schrödinger's cat, it's most compelling while suspended between possibilities neither fully solved nor eternally mysterious. Perhaps that's why we keep retelling it, not to uncover the past but to rehearse our own uncertainties. After all, every era gets the vanished village it deserves. Ours, obsessed with data and DNA, might finally solve it, but then again, some silences are louder with the lights on. DNA doesn't lie, but it doesn't always talk either. In the quest to unravel the village's vanishing, geneticists turn to the one trail the villagers couldn't erase, their own bloodlines. Imagine a lab where vials of saliva from living locals sit beside century-old hair samples pried from family Bibles, all waiting to be sequenced. A groundbreaking study launched in 2019 combed through databases spanning 3 continents, hunting for genetic echoes of those who once called the empty village home. The premise was simple. Even if the graves are gone, the descendants might still be out there, carrying fragments of the past in their very cells. The first hurdle was finding viable DNA. Time and the valley's damp climate hadn't been kind to organic remains. A geneticist on the project compared it to trying to read a book that's been left in the rain. Half the pages are pulp and the ink's bled through. Yet amid the degradation, they struck gold. A lock of hair tucked inside a locket, recovered from the attic of a nearby farmhouse. Its mitochondrial DNA, passed unchanged from mother to child, revealed a haplogroup rare in the region but common in the Carpathian Mountains, hundreds of miles east. Suddenly, the villagers weren't just phantoms. They had roots, a migration path. Privacy laws, though, built walls where science sought bridges. Modern genealogy databases rely on voluntary submissions, and European regulations strictly limit access to genetic records. One researcher grumbled about hitting a firewall of paperwork when trying to cross-reference their findings with commercial ancestry sites. Even when partial matches emerged, a baker in Budapest, a schoolteacher in Lyon, without closer relatives to compare, the trail went cold. The team's lead geneticist refuses to surrender, though. All it takes is one person, she insists. One descendant tested for fun on some app, and suddenly we're not just studying bones, we're reuniting families. The real breakthrough might not come from the living at all. Advances in paleogenomics now allow scientists to extract DNA from objects the dead touched, letters sealed with saliva, pipes clenched between teeth. A museum in the next town over recently catalogued a collection of 19th-century combs, their teeth still threaded with hair. Could one of them hold the key? The irony is palpable. The villagers who left no graves might still be found through the most mundane traces: a strand of hair on a hairpin, fingerprints on a teacup. Their legacy wasn't buried, it was brushed off and forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered in the unlikeliest places. But what if the DNA only deepens the mystery? A preliminary finding from the study hints at an anomaly. Several samples show a genetic marker linked to a tiny ethnic group in the Caucasus, with no known historical connection to the region. Could the villagers have been refugees, exiles, or even converts to some forgotten creed? Genetics can map the where, but the why remains stubbornly out of reach. For now, the lab's freezers hum with potential, each vial holding not just data, but the ghost of a story. The truth might not lie in the soil of the valley, but in the blood of strangers who have never heard its name. And that's the most haunting possibility of all, that the answers are walking among us, unaware they carry the last whispers of a village that refused to be remembered. Exhuming the past is never just about moving earth, it's about moving memories. For some, the only way to solve the village riddle is to dig. Ground-penetrating radar can only hint at what lies beneath. Shovels would bring certainty. But for descendants and locals, the idea of disturbing the soil where ancestors might rest feels like a violation. You don't scrape at a wound to see if it's healed, argues Father Andrei, a priest from the nearest town whose parishioners include families linked to the vanished village. Some silences are sacred, yet archaeologists counter that knowledge has its own sanctity. In 1991, exhumations at a medieval plague pit in London revealed not just mass graves but traces of a previously unknown strain of bacteria, a discovery that reshaped our understanding of pandemics. Could this valley hold similar revelations? The debate isn't just philosophical, it's legal. European heritage laws often prioritize cultural preservation over scientific curiosity. In 2017, a team hoping to excavate a potential burial site near the village was denied permits after protests. Compare this to the 2015 exhumation of Spain's controversial poet Federico Garcia Lorca, whose remains were finally recovered after 80 years of petitions. That dig, though divisive, brought closure to families. Here, with no known descendants to advocate, the ethical lines blur. Would unearthing the truth honor the villagers or strip them of the very anonymity they might have sought? History offers cautionary tales. When researchers disinterred bodies from New York's 19th century, 5 Points slum, they exposed tragic lives cut short by poverty, but also sparked a backlash from living relatives who hadn't consented. Conversely, the 2001 exhumation of the Romanovs confirmed the fate of Russia's last royal family, ending centuries of speculation. The difference: consent. Without clear ties to the village past, modern scholars risk becoming grave-robbers in lab coats. Perhaps what makes this village endure isn't the mystery of its missing graves, but what their absence forces us to confront. In a world obsessed with answers, it's a rare void we can't fill, a reminder that not all stories belong to us. The silence here isn't just an archaeological puzzle. It's a mirror reflecting our own hunger for resolution. We flock to its empty streets not to solve it, but to stand at the edge of the unknowable and feel the pull of what's left unsaid. Some truths aren't buried. They're woven into the act of forgetting itself. Humanity has always been drawn to the spaces between the facts, those gaps in history where the unknown whispers louder than any answer. From the sunken streets of Atlantis to the eerie silence of Flight 370's black box, we're captivated by mysteries that refuse to surrender their secrets. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard once wrote, "Absence is the most powerful story of all, and nowhere is that more true than in this village with no graves." Its empty fields and hollow houses act like a blank canvas, inviting us to project our deepest anxieties and wildest hopes onto its silence. Is it any wonder we've filled the void with tales of cursed cults and vanishing acts? The unknown doesn't just unsettle us, it enthralls us, because it holds up a mirror to the questions we're too afraid to ask out loud. Think about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the unfathomable. The Bermuda Triangle swallows ships, so we invent interdimensional portals. Ancient civilizations leave behind megaliths, and suddenly aliens built them. These aren't just flights of fancy, they're coping mechanisms for a world that refuses to explain itself. The village's missing graves tap into the same primal unease. Death is the ultimate mystery, the one frontier we can't map or master. So when a community seems to have cheated it entirely, or erased it so thoroughly that not even bones remain, it forces us to confront our own fragility. What happens to us when we're gone? Will we leave traces, or will the wind scatter us like dust? The village silence isn't just a historical oddity, it's a metaphor for the terror of being forgotten. Yet there's a strange comfort in the unknowable, too. The fact that some riddles resist solving means the world still holds magic, that not everything can be reduced to data and dirt samples. This village endures in our imagination precisely because it defies resolution. It's a story without an ending, and that incompleteness lets us write our own. For some, it's a ghost story. For others, a lesson in how easily history can be paved over. But perhaps its real power lies in the way it reflects our own unresolved dialogues with mortality. We bury our dead under stone and flowers, but the village's empty earth asks, what if that's not enough? What if memory is the only tombstone that truly lasts? The mystery persists because it's not just about the past, it's about us. Every generation that stumbles upon this place will see something different in its silence, a new shadow to chase. And that's the allure of the gaps. They remind us that some stories aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to be carried, like a question without an answer, heavy and holy in equal measure. We've wandered through a labyrinth of theories, geological whispers of sinkholes swallowing the dead whole, historical hunches of forced migrations or bureaucratic quirks, even the spine-tingling possibility of a faith so radical it erased death itself. Each thread weaves into the village's tangled tale, yet none pulls tight enough to unravel the knot. Maybe that's the point. Some mysteries aren't puzzles to solve but mirrors to stare into, reflecting our own uneasy dance with mortality and memory. Think about it. Every culture grapples with how to mark its passing: pyramids, mausoleums, tiny brass plaques on park benches. We etch names into stone to shout, "We were here," even as time grinds those letters to dust. But this village chose, or was forced into a different path, silence so complete it feels like defiance. Their legacy isn't carved in granite but in absence, a negative space that somehow shouts louder than any epitaph. So here's the unsettling question they leave us with. What will your own legacy bury or erase? Will future strangers sift through your life and find tidy boxes labeled and dated? Or will they hit voids that force them to wonder? There's a quiet courage in that kind of mystery, a refusal to be pinned down by the living's need for closure. As the wind stirs the grass where graves should be, consider this. Perhaps some silences aren't failures of history but its sharpest lessons. The village endures not despite its emptiness but because of it, a reminder that not all stories get endings and not all graves are meant to be found. So where do you stand in this tangled web of theories? Are you Team Plague, convinced a swift and merciless sickness swept through before anyone could dig a single grave? Or Team Cover Up, certain that something darker, something deliberate erased every trace of the departed? Maybe you've got a wildcard theory of your own. Drop it in the comments below. I want to hear every spine-tingling, logic-defying idea you've got. History's greatest puzzles are solved by crowds, not lone detectives, so let's crack this case together. If mysteries like this send shivers down your spine, don't let the adventure stop here. Hit that like button to fuel more deep dives into history's shadowy corners, and subscribe so you never miss an enigma. Turn on notifications too, because trust me, you'll want front row seats when we unravel the next head scratcher. For those hungry to dig deeper, I've left links in the description to some jaw-dropping books. Vanishing Acts by Miranda Ward explores cultures that disappeared without a trace, while Bones Beneath Us dives into forensic archaeology's most chilling cases. And if you're craving more eerie villages, check out The Empty Places, a globe-trotting tour of settlements that time forgot. Now, before you go, here's one last riddle to haunt your thoughts. If a village forgets its dead, does it ever truly live? Or is memory the only soil where the past can take root? Sleep on that if you can.